Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us.
Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and thank you for joining us for another episode of New Wine Tastings. You have heard from and you have seen, no doubt, some of our interviews with Carolyn Custis James. Over the years, we've done written interviews. She has spoken in my Doctor of Ministry cohort at Multnomah Biblical Seminary. We're old friends and co-conspirators, so to speak, in gospel witness, and just really grateful for Carolyn making time today as we talk about the global pandemic, not of COVID-19, but of sexual abuse. We'll be thinking primarily about the Me Too movement and the Church Too movement. So without further ado, thank you, Carolyn, for joining us for New Wine Tastings.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to discuss all of this.
It's always our privilege and pleasure to have you with us. So, Carolyn, you know, this summer when you spoke to our cohort in cross-cultural engagement, you talked about sexual abuse being a global pandemic. Why do you think, Carolyn, that the problem is that widespread, that dramatic, so to speak, for our viewers, in case they're wondering, like, global pandemic, sexual abuse?
Yeah.
Could you please share? Thanks.
You know, a pandemic is a problem that's global. And this, like other pandemics, is, you know, meets that criteria. But also, you know, it's history long. It's you know, roots are in the fall of humanity. And it has in common with other pandemics that it's destroying lives, that it's being mishandled, being badly mishandled. A lot of times when there's an episode of sexual abuse, the blame falls on the victim. And but you know, it's global. You read books like Half the Sky, and you know, and plenty of other books that are shedding light on the fact that women are abused globally, that child sexual abuse is a problem everywhere. It's you know, it touches down in every single culture.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, with child marriages in our culture now, we're having, you know, some of that. And you know, one of the things that when I read Half the Sky, it was an eye-opener for me. And they just Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wujan, a married couple, did the research into what's happening to women and girls globally. And one of the most maddening things to me about that book was that we have had in our hands for over 100 years a similar book that was written by a Christian missionary, Amy Carmichael. I grew up on stories of Amy Carmichael's ministry in India and how she ended up rescuing little girls who were being dedicated by their families to the temple. And nobody ever told me that those little girls were being groomed to be prostitutes. And the first little girl that Amy Carmichael rescued was a 7-year-old, and her hands were scarred by burns. They had put a burning iron on her hands when she tried to escape. But, you know, they in many cultures, especially cultures that are patriarchal, extremely patriarchal. You don't want daughters, you want sons. And so daughters get cast off and they get sold and they get, dedicated to the temple. But, we've had this in front of us all along, and we haven't seen it. And we're behind the curve in responding to this kind of abuse. If the statistics are right in reported sexual abuse, it's 1 in 4 women and girls, 1 in 6 men and boys. So, you look at a stadium full of men cheering in some sport, 1 in 6 has been sexually abused. And, it's 1 in 4 women and girls. So, it's epidemic in its proportions, and it's global in its spread, and it has gone on since the fall.
Well, and as you're speaking of that, Carolyn, I think it's important for viewers and listeners to keep in mind that's of reported cases, correct?
Right.
That's reported. Right. It's so hard, as you alluded to earlier, to even come out as an abuse victim. It's hard. There's shame. I mean, even though they're not the perpetrators, but they often experience shame. They're, in a sense, cultivated to experience shame, even by their victimizers, if you will. And so that's only of reported cases. And I think you made that point to our cohort when you spoke this summer, which is all the more staggering. The numbers are staggering. The percentage is staggering as it is. But just add to that it's probably even worse, makes it even more pronounced.
Yeah. And sometimes to step forward and raise allegations against someone, it's someone you love. It's someone you know very well. So you've got that dynamic. And then, often when it's a church to situation, or just somebody who has been abused and has come to the church for help, you're those who are in a position to help you are all men, and it's really extra intimidating. And a lot of times they don't get it. And very often there are situations, we see it over and over again, where they circle the wagons to protect the person who's being accused because they're an important person in the ministry, or it's gonna ruin their career, or it's gonna bring the shame on the ministry. So there's all this effort to cover up. So, I mean, we have a really huge problem on our hands, and it isn't going away. Mm-hmm. And we get all these other pandemics we have going on right now, just concurrent pandemics. We have, the COVID-19 and the pandemic of racism and poverty, and all of these things are, converging and eclipsing each other. And we can't let up on any of these. They all are, like I said, destroying lives, and and enabling turning a blind eye to things that are really atrocities.
And I think for some of us, for many of us, it can lead us, with all that's going on, all the cultural turmoil, the pandemics that you've mentioned, articulated, it can lead many of us to just shut down and just wish the problem would go away. I remember recently someone saying, I just wish all these problems would go away. My fear is that means just sweep them under the carpet, and, or let's just deal with them in the future. But as Me Too and Church Too and the whole thrust of challenging systems of brutality, militarization, and racism, racialization in our country and beyond, if we don't keep pushing, there won't be that turning point or that tipping point where we can actually make headway. We can actually become more calloused, and we go back to a state of indifference, and the status quo seeps in. So I think a lot of important momentum right now on a variety of issues, but it's so easy, if we're not vigilant, because of whether it's just people shutting down or pushback or whatever, that we just start coasting, and coasting is going to lead to regression. And so I think it's important that we keep pressing into this, and that God would give us resilience. When we feel like we don't have any more bandwidth or strength, we say, Lord, help me in my weakness. When we are weak, then Christ's strength shows up in abundant measure when we lean into Christ. And so with that in mind, moving forward into greater advocacy, even agitation. I remember Frederick Douglass saying to a young abolitionist, I've quoted this a few times on recent New Wine Tastings posts, when he was asked, what should I do to Frederick Douglass? He said, agitate, agitate, agitate. So to here, not just on slavery, but also sex slavery, not just racial slavery, treating, people of a certain skin color as chattel. The same type of thing happens when it comes to sexual abuse, treating people as just bodies, as flesh, as a pound of flesh to use for one's lust and greed. And so with that in mind, let's go deeper into the issue of Me Too and Church Too, in case just by chance there's a viewer or listener who says, what? Me Too? Church Too? Could you define those terms, hashtag Me Too, hashtag Church Too, etc.?
Yes. Well, the Me Too hashtag was created by a civil rights activist. Her name is Tarana Burke. And she did it to let African American women know that they were not alone in being abused. And, there were just a lot of stories in the news that where women were speaking up, that opened the floodgates of what is really happening. So it was the Harvey Weinstein New York Times report, and I'll say this, that they need credit for what they've done. The secular press tends to be the force that exposes these things. It's not the church that's doing it, which is really sad.
Grateful for the secular press doing their job. It's like, but it should be an exhortation to us to do our job.
Yeah. I mean, yes, absolutely. And we're working on that, but it's slow, because it's uncomfortable. It's shameful to the church, that
taboos, religious taboos, and I know we'll unpack that, but yeah, it's
I think we've felt like spectators, that we're on the sidelines. We're watching the Catholic Church go through all of the scandal with clergy abuse of young, mainly I think boys, but girls too. And so it's sort of been thrown in our faces that it's a huge problem inside the church. And so anyway, I will say this, I always feel like it needs to be said that when the Access Hollywood tape was released and the current occupant of the White House was heard boasting of assaulting women, and evangelical leaders doubled down on their support of him, I have to say, it's really hard to get over that. And there are, and women inside and outside the church heard that. And in fact, one young gal who was raised by an evangelical leader who wasn't part of that, but she said, that's when they lost me. And she had to rethink everything about her Christianity when, these leaders, like Wayne Grudem, whose mantra has been for years that real men protect women, and James Dobson, who has been fighting for years to end bullying, and we have others like Jerry Falwell Jr. and Eric Metaxas and others who have doubled down on their support of Trump. Like I said, it's hard to get over that. And women inside and outside the church heard that.
Mhm.
And
And hopefully men inside the church hear it too, that because it has to be in solidarity that we address these matters. And so you're right. I mean, it is hurting the church when
yeah,
we don't hold accountable such acts, such language, for the sake of people, for the sake of Christ.
yeah. So then when some women, there were over a dozen who stepped forward and said that had happened to them in relationship to Trump, more women started speaking out, and they did it with the Me Too hashtag. And they named names, and some of them said what happened to them on Twitter, and all they could do was say hashtag Me Too. It just is. But it's interesting to me that it has taken collective voices to empower women and men too to speak out about this. It's not. It's a very personal affront, that a violation of somebody's humanity. But it takes a village, for women to be able to speak out. And what happened directly after that was that we started seeing the hashtag church too.
Mm-hmm.
And we're still seeing it come out, where women inside the church are saying it happened to them inside the church, not outside. I mean, we have, if the statistics hold up, it means we have survivors in our churches, and they hear what's being said from the pulpit. They hear what's not being said. And they see these stories, and we've reached a point where the question comes up, where do you go for help when you're being abused? And the church really has eliminated themselves for being a safe place. I mean, it's hard to say, well, go to the church, to get help and protection. The church itself is not safe.
And that's a very sobering point, isn't it? That the church is not safe.
Yeah.
And it's so often true. It's not safe because we are not holding ourselves accountable like we need to across the board in solidarity to address this global pandemic of abuse, of sexual abuse and the like.
And the same failures that we see in other pandemics are present in the Me Too, Church Too pandemic, because you have leadership that is uninformed and denies and ignores or covers up or mishandles or mistreats, and it's in all these pandemics that you have a re-abusing of those who are suffering from the problem, because there's an unwillingness to confront it, and there's an ineptness in how it's confronted, because churches tend to think that this is an internal matter. It's not. It's a criminal matter.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to report to law enforcement. We need the help of trauma counseling professionals. There needs to be an outside independent investigation of what has happened. And the church leaders have been inclined to believe that they're sufficient to handle these kinds of things, and they're not. They're just not. And it's wrong to expect that of them.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And, a couple of points that you've made as we transition, I just want to highlight again, it said, why does it take so many to move it forward? And I think, that's always true, I believe, in social dynamics. Even what we're seeing now in terms of racialization, Black Lives Matter groups, individuals who never were part of the discussion at all, now seemingly moving forward and saying, we support this. I think of the NFL. I mean, the NFL's supposed change on these matters. But there's a tipping point. Again, there's a tipping point in crowd dynamics and social structures, how we think in terms of structuration. And with evangelicals, you know, our religious tribe, so to speak, because we emphasize so much the individual personal relationship with Jesus, which is a hallmark of our tradition, I'm not demeaning that in any way, shape, or form, we often tend to fail to see that if we only emphasize the personal individual relationship, we're never going to have the kind of impact socially that we can have if we don't couple that with collective social solidarity, which is a hallmark of other faith traditions, including other Christian traditions. And so we need to couple that personal individual with the collective emphasis, like church too, that there is a collective voice. And then also, just I wanted to highlight this as well as we move forward. You mentioned the parallel with other pandemics and the masking, the denying. You know, we're hearing right now, well, and we reflect upon the recent past, this COVID-19 or this coronavirus, it's fake news, it's not really happening. Well, look at the impact of that. Look at the impact of that in our society. Denying that it was the case or minimizing it, thinking that it really isn't an issue or that it's over and there won't be a second wave. Well, the second wave seems to be coming. That's not fake news. But again, I think all these things are connected. And while you see abuse sexually, certainly in both political parties, the two major political parties in our country, it's not to say it's just on one side of the aisle. Nonetheless, for evangelicals, where we may place ourselves, we need to get our own house in order, both religiously, in terms of how we identify culturally, politically, and hold people accountable on whatever the issue, whether it's on science, on pandemics like coronavirus, or sexual abuse as well. As hard as it is to deal with sexual abuse in society at large, Carolyn, I wonder if it is harder, and you've already alluded to this in some respects, but I wonder if it is harder to address it in the church culture. What do you think of that? And if you agree, why do you think that might be harder?
Some of it has to do with what you just said, you know, that the gospel is about personal salvation, and that our goal is to evangelize, and not that should change how we live, not just morally, but socially, as you say, that this is God's world that he loves and that he created to flourish, and he created it for every human being to flourish. And as his image bearers, we join our Creator in that. And it's not just that we are activists, but as we should be, but it's that we embody what this is. And we don't. You know, we fight among ourselves. We value some people more than others in our congregations.
And James has a lot to say about that in James 1 and 2.
Oh my goodness, you know. And so, you know, to bring our Christianity into the news, to bring our Christianity into how we think about everything, to say, okay, how does this, you know, how am I working out my salvation with fear and trembling? I don't have all the answers. I look at these crises and I don't understand everything about it. I'm not a doctor. I can't diagnose, you know, what COVID means and how it spreads and what we should do. I have to listen to the experts and the medical professionals who are telling us what to do. And, you know, I'm a white, privileged American, and there are so many things about the the COVID pandemic and the racial pandemic that I escape because I am white. And I have to listen. I have to listen. And people in power need to listen to women and men who are speaking out about sexual violence and abuse. Because, you know, the biggest problem that we have is thinking we understand. And then we need to wrestle with how does my Christianity call me to engage or support or whatever it is. You know, I'm as an image bearer, I'm not a spectator. I'm not on the outside. I have responsibility. And we all do. And you know, one of the things that has impacted me so much is the book of Ruth, where somebody who's on the outside, somebody who's in a different race, somebody who's impoverished, somebody who has none of the connections or attributes that would bring value or meaning to her in the eyes of the community, is God's point person in that moment of history. And I don't look at the big name women in the Bible. I look at Ruth, and she puts me to shame. And I think, you know, if Ruth, why not me? You know, if Ruth, why not you? You know, who are we to say that what we're doing that nobody sees or notices is strategic for God's kingdom purposes today? You know, it's we don't know what God is doing, and we don't know how he's working, and he just might be working through us.
Amen. I say, preach it, sister, preach it. And, you know, just, you know, if we read the Bible like you read the Bible, and study it like you study the Bible, and write like you write, not that everyone can write so well, to say the least, but, and by the way, please pick up Carolyn Custis James' book on the Gospel according to Ruth, and other works where she unpacks scripture on a variety of themes related to our subject matter and related themes. Please pick those up. But when you read the scriptures, you see how God over and over again brings down the proud, lifts up the humble and poor. Even the Magnificat of the Lord's mother, you know, Mary, one of my favorite texts in all of scripture, you know, how you've brought down the proud and the mighty and lifted up the poor, just like her and her son. And Jesus says, blessed are the poor in Luke. He says, blessed are the poor in spirit in Matthew. And those are distinct, though inseparably related. Both are important. They're not the same point, but they're related points. Sermon on the Plain, Sermon on the Mount. You see that over and over again. You were getting at it before. James 1 and 2. And, you know, Acts 4. I just, for our viewers, to encourage them, step up, step out, speak up, speak out, as you do it in the Lord. And you might be the only one. David was the only one who would fight the Philistines. And he was just a little shepherd boy, right? And so you see that how God just opposes the proud, and he lifts up the foolish and weak. 1 Corinthians 1. And then just lastly, as I was alluding to a minute ago, Acts 4, you know, they took note that these were unschooled, ordinary men about the apostles, right?
Yeah.
And they took note, the religious power brokers, the political power brokers took note that these men had been with Jesus. And I'd like to be a part of that, you know, that little group. You know, God lifts up the weak and the foolish, and brings down the wise and the powerful. And that is not a message that's embraced by the American church, and I need to embrace it more. But it's, you know, the letters of the Corinthian church, to the Corinthian church by Paul, are like to the American church today, as is the book of James. And so you've just once again brought it home to us. And I think also, Carolyn, tell me if I'm wrong, but it's in part so difficult for us to engage sexual abuse in the church further to what you had said earlier, and that is a whole ministry, we say, could crumble. You know, if you take out this Jenga block, the whole Jenga tower is going to crumble and fall. And we think, so it's better to put up with this little area of foibles and flaws, one might claim, rather than have the whole tower come down. But I don't think people are realizing the whole tower is coming down. Not the church that Christ establishes, but the churches that we establish. Christ's church will not falter. The gates of hell will not prevail against the church, but our own context, that might happen there, because that Jenga tower is falling, because we're not accounting for it. And the end does not justify the means. Like, put up with it with this political or religious leader so that we get from that certain political power bases or initiatives put forth. I think that there's a lot of that in evangelical Christianity in America. The end justifies the means, and that's pragmatism of a certain kind. That's not biblicism. And I just hope people are not on the bandwagon for a few moments because of the fact that somehow we think we're going to ride that wave. This is a marathon race on the sexual pandemic, as is the racial pandemic, the racism pandemic. These are not photo ops. This is for the long haul. Yeah. And there will be pushback, as Cornel West said the other day. There will be pushback. So are we going to be about the end being Christ and his kingdom, rather the end justifies the means for some momentary or short-term gain? And I think that's a key part of it as well. Carolyn, if we could turn our attention to one or two of the stories that you shared in the Doctor of Ministry cohort with my students and me, and that is the story of gymnast Rachel Den Hollander. Very sobering story, where she came out, as did many, many others, and called out the gymnastics doctor. I think he was for the U.S. Olympic team, if I'm not mistaken, Larry Nassar. And I believe he's in prison, correct, for many, many years for being convicted and found guilty in court for abusing all these gymnasts. And she was one of them. And my understanding is her church rebuked her. They came out hard against her for this. She lost a lot of friends and associates. She's a committed Christian. It just baffles my mind how that can be. Could you, that they would operate that way. Could you unpack that? Because it was just staggering to me.
Yeah, she spoke out against her church that was being, because the leadership was being supportive of C.J. Mahaney and the Sovereign Grace Ministry child abuse scandal. Mahaney was the leader of that organization and was under investigation for cover-up. And she was the very first, she's an attorney, and she was, but that didn't make it any easier for her to step forward about what Larry Nassar had done. But she was the first one to raise allegations against him. And once again, it was with support of the secular media, the press, that took the story, and it just exploded because it was over 200 young girls who had been abused under the guise of medical treatment for injuries that they had experienced in gymnastics. And he was supposedly the expert on how to treat them, and instead he was sexually abusing them. And but I think for her speaking out and going through that experience of accusing him and the trial for him, it empowers her. She is somebody who knows what she's talking about. And she was upset because her church was one of many that was supportive of C.J. Mahaney and still giving him a platform. And what
had happened there with C.J. Mahaney again for viewers?
He was under investigation for cover-up of the abuse that happened in his organization. So there were convictions of child sexual abuse in the Sovereign Grace Ministries. And so this wasn't child's play. This was a big, serious thing. And CJ had all kinds of supporters. He was much loved within complementarian circles. And, so they just couldn't let go of him. That's really what happens, in a lot of these circumstances, that the person who's there have been allegations against is somebody who is beloved and respected, and they have a way of recycling themselves back into ministry even after it's the legitimacy of the accusations are supported. So it's messy. It's always messy when there are allegations against somebody who's in a position of leadership. And so she was, rebuked by her church for being divisive, because she was saying they shouldn't be supporting him. They should be, wanting this to be cleared up by an independent investigation. And so anyway, but she has become a voice. She wrote a book, What is a Girl Worth? Mm. And I think anybody who reads that book is going to get a big picture of what's involved in sexual abuse, because you go through her own struggle to step forward and say that she was abused herself by Larry Nassar. You hear from her when she's talking about what she hears in church and how she was just traumatized again when she heard a pastor speaking and saying that about the rape of Dinah, Jacob's daughter, that that's what happens to girls who leave their father's protection. Yeah, she hears that, as somebody who's been abused, and it just is devastating at a whole new level. That's why I'm saying people who have been abused hear what's being said or what's not being said from the pulpit. And so anyway, and then she talks about then becoming an advocate for other abuse victims. And she really is a prominent voice within evangelicalism. But what she said is, and I'll read the quote, she said, "Church is one of the least safe places to acknowledge abuse because of the way it is counseled is more often than not damaging to the victim. There is an abhorrent lack of knowledge for the damage and devastation of sexual assault. It is with deep regret that I say church is one of the worst places to go for help. There are very, very few who have ever found true help in the church." That was her own experience, that this wasn't a safe place to be looking for help, and the church itself is not a safe place.
And I don't hear her words, for those who may be, wondering. I don't hear her words as someone who is a critic outside the fold, not someone who's standing outside and just trying to take shots at all. I take them as the words of someone who's critiquing a community, an entity that she dearly loves. And that's my sense from that statement. It's not out to bash, it's out to challenge in order that we might grow as the church for Christ. And I think we often have voices that say, just get on board, support, don't critique. Well, there are different kinds of critique. And I see this as someone who is ultimately loyal to wanting to see the church become a place of healing, not harming. And again, the book title is How Much is a Girl Worth, correct?
What is a Girl Worth?
What is a Girl Worth? And that's by Rachel Denhollander. And then also I encourage you to, as I said earlier, read Carolyn Custis James' works, Maelstrom, Half the Church, The Gospel According to Ruth, and others. As we proceed further in what's really a two-part interview, an interview in two parts, two phases, speaking of pastors, we've spoken about the church. We've mentioned at different points pastors, Carolyn, and thank God for great pastors who shepherd well. The question that arises here, why is it so hard to come out and speak of abuse in general, as in Me Too, and then more specifically as in Church Too, especially when dealing with people who are in spiritual authority roles? You've already alluded to some of this, but I think the psychological dynamic is really pronounced when it comes to spirituality and religion. And I just want to say before you respond, the viewer needs to understand that Carolyn comes from a family steeped in spiritual leadership. I mean, her dad was a professor at my own university back in the day when it was a Bible college. He was a professor at Multnomah. And also he was a pastor of Central Bible Church, I believe, correct? And other churches. And then her husband is a seminary president, so he trains pastors and Carolyn's closely connected. So it's like, I don't think you can get closer to pastors and churches than Carolyn and her family, so to speak. But could you speak to this issue, Carolyn, of why is it so hard, especially when dealing with leaders and authority figures in the church, the psychological religious dynamic in play that keeps us from really taking this to heart and addressing it well?
There's a way in which we're dishonest in the church about a lot of things. When you don't bring your brokenness to church, you bring your togetherness. You can't talk about. You can't come in and say, I'm struggling with something. It's where everybody's sort of got it together. And I think that's one huge strike against us when it comes to the Me Too thing. We could watch the Catholic Church going through all of that and never wonder if those kinds of things happen in our ranks. So, that's one thing. And the other thing is, I have a really big problem with the word authority. And I think that it's at the heart of what we're talking about here, both in what happens when there are abusive situations, but also when it's addressed or there are attempts to address it. And I got into a discussion with the pastor at one point where he was, wanting to be more open in how he involved women in his church. But he also wanted to reiterate that he was in the position of authority in that church. And I kept saying to him, what if you exchanged the word authority for responsibility? And how would that change how you look at how you do your job? I mean, wasn't Jesus talking to Peter about responsibility when he said, feed my lambs, take care of my sheep? He wasn't saying, now you're in a position of authority here. In fact, he said the opposite thing to his disciples. We've twisted it into servant leader with a capital L.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? It's like one of my colleagues at Multnomah, Dr. Bayless, says we all want to be called servant leaders until someone treats us like one, like a servant, namely. But yeah, we put the emphasis not on the servant, but on the leader. It's amazing how we twist it, right? I mean, you hear this all the time, lead servant, and I'm sure people mean well. I'm sure people mean well most of the time. But it's like we don't realize, I mean, I'm called to be a servant. Lead as a servant, but you don't have to call yourself lead servant or servant leader. It just be a servant.
You're called to be a gospel leader, that you're called to be. We all are called to leadership, and we're all called to be leadership that's looking out for other people. It's not leadership that's looking out for yourself. And I think, your reputation or I don't mean you, but I mean anybody.
What reputation? So yeah.
But it's, and I think the way we talk about leadership is at the heart of what's going on here, and what makes it difficult for those in official positions of leadership to take care of the sheep. You know, it's I think ministry callings are burdens. They're not supposed to be status or you know, celebrity or whatever. It's we're called to look after.
And I hear the language a lot of times about significant leaders, significant church, and I go, I don't know if people realize how fleshly that is. It's not just sounding fleshly, it is fleshly. Because all I can say is, show me someone who's close to Christ and I'll say they're significant. I don't care how well known they are or how big their church or ministry is. Show me someone who's not connected to Christ, and I don't care how big or how well known, they ain't significant. And I mean, the Bible makes this quite clear. And I think part of the problem too, Carolyn, is the cult of personality. Dietrich Bonhoeffer referred to this problem, and he said of the elder in his reflections on the pastoral epistle, I think it's in Life Together, he goes, there's nothing said about the personality of the leader. It's only about whether the leader has faithfully discharged their ministry, what's been entrusted. I think that is so refreshing. It's so spot on. And I love your point about reframing authority by way of responsibility. Jesus didn't have to walk around and say, hey, I'm the rabbi, I'm the rabbi, I'm the leader, it just happened because he spoke with authority. He lived with authority. He was authoritative because it came out of his person. He didn't prove it to people in the sense of, here I am, look at me. And I think it's such a distortion, and that plays to abuse. It plays to abuse in our culture. And so we're going to turn our attention in the next episode of this two-part series, shall we say, with Carolyn Custis James on the global pandemic of sexual abuse. So stay tuned for the next episode, which will follow on the heels of this one, for New Wine Tastings. Carolyn Custis James and Dr Metzger, thank you for joining us here at New Wine Tastings. Blessings.